Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Down Periscope, Up Periscope. I'm Tim, your host, and here is another interview from a Blueback volunteer tour guide and a former Barbel class sailor. So, our featured volunteer tour guide in this post is Tony Capitano. Tony served in the U.S. Navy as an internal communications electrician, second class, and later as a missile technician, second class. His time in the Navy included duty aboard the submarines USS Barbel, SS 580, USS Cusk, SS/SSG/AGSS 348, and USS Lewis and Clark, SSBN 644, aka USS Lost and Confused, as he calls it. He joined OMSI and the Blueback as a tour guide in 2008. Tony is unique, being one of the two tour guides to have served on one of the three Barbel class subs. The other is Rick Nolt, who served on Bonefish and Blueback. Of course, I previously did an interview with Rick Nolt about the Bonefish fire. You can check that out as well. Tony's technical knowledge of the submarine pretty much surpasses all of us. Always one for conversation, Tony's plethora of stories is enhanced by his pleasant demeanor and fun attitude. And as an aside, his last name actually means captain in Italian. So had he been an officer and risen to the rank of captain in 06, then that would just be the ultimate redundancy. You can imagine someone introducing him, right? This is the skipper, Captain Capitano, i.e. Captain. I know, but what is he? What is his name? That is his name, Captain. What? Anyway, let's get on with the interview. Hello, everyone. Welcome back. I have a very special guest for you today, one of our other Barbel class sailors, apart from Rick Nolt. I'm here with Tony Capitano, a submarine veteran, and we're just going to ask him a little bit about his time in the Navy and what it was like being on submarines. So welcome, Tony.
Hi.
Could you tell us where you're from and why you joined the Navy?
Oh, cool. Well, I was born in Buffalo, New York, but I moved to Tennessee in grade school, so I don't know where I come from. Anyway, why did I join the Navy? Well, I think I watched a lot of Victory at Sea movies when I was a kid, and submarines were kind of cool, and I thought, well, that'd be fun. And my brother joined the Navy too. He was in the Navy before me. He was on an oiler though. That didn't seem like a real fun job to me. So running around throwing lines across to another ship and filling them up didn't sound like a good job. So I joined the Navy in 1960. I went to San Diego for boot camp. Went to ACE school in San Diego as well, ICA school. Then I went to sub school right after that. My sub school lasted a little longer because I ended up, first thing back then, the first thing you did was do the tank test. And if you didn't pass the tank test, you didn't go to sub school. Well, I ruptured my eardrum, so I had to wait another 6 weeks before they let me do it again. And so I took a little longer at sub school than normal. And then I reported aboard the Barbel. The Barbel was in the shipyard in Kittery, Maine. She just finished doing an overhaul. Well, I reported aboard in June, I believe, and we didn't leave till December because everything 5 inches and above was torn out and rebuilt because she took 350 tons of water in the engine room on a deep dive. So they overhauled her and moved the bow planes to the sail at the same time. So we spent a lot of time in the yard. We did some training during the yard, but most of the lines and stuff were torn out. So I ended up mess cooking once we got underway, and our first home port was Norfolk, Virginia. So we were in Norfolk for Christmas, and like I was telling you the other day, one of the electricians got a Christmas card from Yokosuka, Japan saying, "See you next year." And next year we were in Yokosuka, Japan. So that's kind of interesting. We went through the canal, spent about a month and a half in the Caribbean, hitting a few islands and stuff, then went through the canal. We were supposed to stop in Acapulco, but one of the enginemen got hepatitis, so they wouldn't let us in. This was back when they didn't have any shots for hepatitis. And so they airdropped a bunch of stuff to us, and the corpsman gave us all a shot. But we got to stop in a little town above Acapulco called Manzanilla, which was kind of fun because it was a little bitty town and it had just this oil dock that was there. So it wasn't a major docking system. But they had a wedding. So they invited us to the wedding. The whole town was involved in the wedding. So it was kind of fun. We had an open house for the sub. So we had people coming down the main hatch, going out the torpedo room hatch. So it was kind of interesting. Then we were stationed in San Diego for a period of time, did ops out of San Diego, went to the Seattle World's Fair, and then got stationed in Hawaii. So we went from Norfolk to San Diego to Hawaii. Did a couple tours, Westpac tours. I ended up getting transferred to the Cusk after that because I signed up to change my rate to missileman, and they were getting ready to go to Westpac again. So the XO said, "Well, I'm not going to take you with me because I don't want to transfer you in Yokosuka or someplace." So he said, "You got a chance. You either spend 3 months or so up in the sub barracks," because at the time in Hawaii we actually had barracks that we stayed in, so we had lockers for our clothes and stuff. So he said you could either go up there and be a master at arms, or the Cusk, which is a Baleo class submarine, was going to Tahiti, and they needed an IC electrician. So I went to Tahiti for 3 months, then went to school. So I just spent a TAD to them. I should say I started out as a fireman, E3 IC striker, and I left as a E5 IC man. I qualified on all electrical watches on the Barbel. I qualified as an IC electrician, roving watch, senior controlman, junior controlman. So I stood all the electrical watches. I think the main reason they wanted to do that, the electrician in my duty section did not want to stand battery watches during the in port. So he made sure I was qualified to do the battery charges in port. Well, it's a 4 or 5 hour watch, so depending on how bad the battery is. So he didn't want to do it. He just didn't stand a watch as a below decks guy instead of standing the watch in the back.
And perhaps for our listeners, could you explain what an IC electrician does?
Oh, an IC electrician. Well, IC electricians take care of. On this class of submarine was kind of nice because everything on the submarine, one end of the switch was mine and the other end of the switch was mine. So all the all the servo valves, all that stuff is something I had to work on, And so it was a nice submarine because everything in the submarine had a part of electrical connection to it. So all those switches on the control panel, the other end of it, and that switch is my problem. Plus, we took care of all the navigation equipment, the gyros, the dead reckoning analyzers, the plotters, all the plotters, all the sound powered phones. Yeah, sound powered phones. That's another project. For instance, all the external cabling I ended up working on. So the masts, all the masts have cables in there. And I remember being in Yokosuka underneath the sail, patching a cable with we had this plastic device that you would trim the insulation off and put this plastic device on, fill it up with epoxy and close it up and seal it. So those are the kind of things that we would be doing.
I see. And you recounted a story to me earlier. Could you tell the one about that sailor where you pressurized the boat and you opened up the hatch to the sail and ended up flying out of it?
Right. Yeah, we were on our way to Seattle, and we stopped in San Francisco, and they decided to put a 5-pound pressure test on the main compartment. So the living compartment, which is the largest compartment on the ship, it's about 22,000 cubic feet or something like that. Don't remember exactly. But anyway, they put a 5-pound pressure on, and then you hold it for, I don't know, 15 minutes or something to make sure there's no leaks. And then you start bleeding it off. Well, it takes time to bleed that much air off. And he went up to the hatch and thinking that it was at a level where he could crack the hatch. And when he cracked the hatch just flew open, and he ejected himself. Unfortunately, he did never come back to the submarine. I think he was in the hospital for a long time. Severe head injuries because there's an I-beam above that hatch. So I think he took a direct hit on that.
Ouch. All right. Well, I believe eventually you transferred to a boomer, right?
Yes, I ended up going to missile school. We went to an A school and a C school. So it was 57 weeks of school. So then I got transferred to the Lewis and Clark, which was a new construction boat. I picked it up in Newport News, Virginia. And so I spent the end of my career on that. We went on several cruises, which were kind of fun. So being a missileman is totally different than being an ice seaman, but it was a nice job. I enjoyed it.
So how was the transition from being on an attack submarine to being on a ballistic missile submarine? Did it require let you to requalify and
Oh yeah, you got to requalify. Well, if I'd have stayed longer on the Cusk, I would have had to requalify on it. But I was only there 3 months, and so requalifying wasn't going to happen because it is totally different class of submarine than the Barbel. So
right?
I would have had to requalify on it. So yeah, I requalified on that. We went through the entire nukes and everything. So that was fun. It's kind of different, like on a diesel boat. You basically, once you qualify, you keep going through the boat because you're the below decks watch. So in ports, you're constantly wandering through the boat, checking valves and checking the bilges and stuff. So you stay pretty well qualified on the boat. But on a nuke, you got the forward group, you got the missile group, and then you got the nukes. And once you qualified, you didn't really mess with the other end of the submarine. So, yeah, you're qualified, but I'm not sure if you're qualified as well. Let's put it that way.
Okay. All right. So, given that a boomer's job is to simply go out, hide, act as a nuclear deterrent, did you notice any kind of difference in the culture of being on a ballistic missile boat versus an attack boat?
Well, no, I didn't, because most of the guys that I was on the boat with were old diesel sailors, so
Oh,
they were already qualified on diesel boats. So they were pretty much the same group of guys. Although, I talked to a few guys on tours here. I was talking to a guy that was a diesel guy and went to a nuke after that. And he didn't like it because he just didn't think it was the same camaraderie. And maybe it isn't. But the group that I was with were all ex diesel sailors. So they were, this was in the transition period. This was in the early 60s. So
right.
most of the guys were diesel guys. And I ran around with more engineering guys than I did anybody else on the submarine because I was a come from the E gang. So most of the guys I ran around with were nukes.
So, would you compare life being on a big boomer, very nice, versus like a cramped attack boat?
Well, this boat was really nice. This boat was nice in the fact that we very seldom had to hot bunk or anything because this boat was originally designed as a downrange missile tracking ship. Okay,
The Barbel, right?
the Barbel was. And where the sonar room is on this ship was actually all the SINS gear and all the stuff for tracking missiles. Okay. Well, when they flooded, they tore all that stuff out. And our sonar room was up where the crypto room is on this submarine.
Oh.
Okay, our sonar room was behind radio. Okay. Well, they left that there because the Chiefs decided they wanted to make that room the Chiefs' quarters. So we ended up with an extra set of bunks because that became the Chiefs' quarters, and the Chiefs' quarters on this boat was senior first class. I mean, we had to have a lot of people on board the hot bunk, so we very seldom hot bunk. So I didn't ever run across the deal of hot bunking. You know, it was a different boat compared to this boat.
I see. So, how would you describe the captains on the boats you were on?
I enjoyed all my captains. They were all very good. The captain went aboard the Barbel. He was a senior commander. When we hit San Diego, he left and went to the War College, and then the XO became the captain. And he was very good. I really enjoyed it. He actually became an admiral. He was a pretty sharp guy. He was nice. That's the other thing. On the Barbel and on the Lewis and Clark, I was the captain's phone talker, so I got involved with the captain a lot. I knew the captains quite well because during maneuvering and stuff, I was always standing behind the captain and officer's deck, reporting whatever they said, And on this class, during battle stations, I was the captain's phone talker. So yeah, I got along good with the captains.
What years were you on Barbell and what years were you on Lewis and Clark?
I was on the Barbell from 1961 to 63. And then I was on the Cusk for 3 months. In October of 63, I went to school. So 57 weeks later, I ended up on the Lewis and Clark. So the end of my career, the last hitch of my Navy was on the Lewis and Clark. So
I see. And when did you get out of the Navy?
I got out in 1967.
Well, moving on, what brought you to OMSI and when did you become a blueback tour guide?
Well, I knew about the blueback. I came down several times and looked at it a few times, but the job I had, I traveled a lot, so I didn't have any possibility of doing this. I ended up leaving for weeks at a time, so it wasn't something that was a good idea for me. So when I retired in 2008, I signed up to be a tour guide.
When you started being a tour guide, what feelings did you have walking through another B-girl boat? Did it bring back any kind of nostalgic memories for you?
Yeah, it did. Although, like I said, this boat's gone through a lot of transitions, so things are moved around, and where they would have been on the Barbell, they weren't there. So plus they added stuff that you know that we didn't have in the past. So like we didn't have the prairie masking system. That was not a part of the original sub. I don't know when they put that on here.
So, kind of, how would you characterize your time at OMSI as a volunteer and a tour guide here on Blueback?
I really enjoy this. This is a lot of fun. I enjoy talking about the different submarines, especially since I've been on 3 different classes. So, which I figure to me it's kind of neat because I was able to go backwards and spend 3 months on an older boat, which is totally different. I slept in the after torpedo room on the Cusk on my way to Tahiti and woke up in the middle of the night with this huge noise and cables running and stuff. The after marker buoy let loose, and while we were submerged, so it's just spailing out. So we had to surface in the middle of the Pacific, and we got up on top, and actually they ended up shooting it till they sunk it. Well, they were not going to retrieve it and try to put it back in, so they shot at it till they sunk it, and then cut the cable and let it go. Oh, that was the nice thing about going to the Tahiti is I got to cross the equator, which was kind of a fun job. And on one of those boats, you actually surface and do it on the surface. So we crossed the equator on the surface, and they had this big garbage suit, and you had to crawl through the garbage suit and get people beat on you and kiss the belly of King Neptune and all that stuff. So it was fun. We had swim call as well.
All right, well, we're coming up to the end. Is there anything else you want to say to any listeners out there?
Not really, I don't think. Just come on down to the Barbell and visit.
Well, thank you very much for your time, Tony. Again, it's just really unique. It's always great having you here, having another B girl sailor, and you bring a very unique perspective to these boats, and we're glad to have you. All right, now just to make a few notes here about some of the things Tony was discussing in his interview, he said that some of the areas inside the sail itself can be accessed via the bridge access trunk at the forward end of the sail, but otherwise, he would mostly just crawl into the sail from below it, and that was done via the turtleback superstructure. Tony mentioned that it took him about 1 year to re-qualify on USS Lewis and Clark, although he also mentioned that it's generally easier the second time around, even though it was a completely different submarine. When Tony talks about the SINS gear, he's referring to the Submarine Inertial Navigation System. It's somewhat similar to the INS system that's on aircraft as well, except, designed for submarines. Tony also told me that he slept on one of the middle racks on 2nd Street aboard Barbel, and that he never actually hot bunked on any submarine that he was on, so he considers himself pretty lucky in that regard. Now, Tony technically passed the exam for Missile Technician First Class, but he left the Navy before advancing because there were not enough missile technician billets on ballistic missile submarines at the time. Because missile technicians only work on ballistic missiles, the only ballistic missiles in the Navy are on ballistic missile submarines. Now, for some other stories, regarding Tony's story of Barbel flooding, the deck logs for the boat for 30 November 1960 show that the boat was participating in the training exercise SlamX while operating off Norfolk, Virginia. At 10:03, flooding was reported in the engine room. The boat conducted an emergency surface, went ahead full, and rigged for collision. The engine room reported that the discharge line for the number 1 saltwater circulating pump was carried away. At 10:50, the boat secured from collision quarters, and at 11:20, the engine room bilges were pumped dry. Now, due to the flooding, the following material casualties were reported. The number 2 and 3 main generators, the trim pump priming pump, the trim system, and the number 1 saltwater priming pump were pretty much destroyed. Thankfully, there were no personnel casualties during this flooding. When Tony mentioned that everything above 5 inches had to be torn out of the boat, he means that the piping itself had to be replaced, since that's what failed and caused the flooding. Tony also recounted a story of how, before his time aboard her, the USS Cuss took part in the early US Navy submarine missile tests. The first missiles developed for launching from submarines were American copies of the German V-1, aka Buzz Bomb. The German V-1 was a 27.5-foot long, 4,917-pound missile with a 1,830-pound high-explosive warhead. It was launched via a steam catapult trolley from a 157-foot long rail on land. The pulse jet engine propelled the missile up to 400 miles per hour for 150 miles before the engine cut off, and the missile dove toward the ground to hit its target. Now, by July of 1944, the Allies had enough intelligence to begin copying the V-1. Further tests designated the missile as the JB-2 by the U.S. Army and the Loon by the U.S. Navy. By November of 1944, Admiral King expressed interest in using these to strike land targets from escort carriers. U.S. military modifications to the design included replacing the German steam catapult with a rocket booster to get the missile airborne, and the addition of radio guidance with a radio beacon, which allowed an operator on a ship or a trailing aircraft to track and course correct the missile with the ability to steer it left, right, or dive the missile. The minimum operational range of the missile was specified at 100 nautical miles, with the weapon cruising at 1,000 to 6,000 feet, and the control aircraft at 10,000 to 20,000 feet. Use against land targets at 100 nautical miles involved using early warning aircraft, quote-unquote Cadillac, for control, and for use against ship targets at less than 100 nautical miles using shipborne fire control radars. Admiral King approved the large-scale program on 12 April 1945, and the Navy designated the missile as Loon on the 16th. In July 1945, an escort carrier commenced training off Point Mugu, California, and the first Loon was fired on 7 January 1946, but it crashed into the ocean when the engine died. Willis Overland built copies of the V-1 called the LTV-N2, which were 2.8 feet in diameter and 27 feet long, with a 17.7-foot wingspan. They had a 2,000-pound warhead and a claimed circular error probable of 1/2 nautical miles. While more accurate than the German V-1, the Loon had an average error of 400 meters, or about a quarter of a mile, at 116 kilometers or 100 miles range under optimal conditions. Now, plans were made for the mass production of the missile and for bombarding Japan with it from ships and nearby captured islands, but the dropping of the atomic bombs ended the war before it was deployed by the Americans. Post-war plans were drawn up on 5 March 1946 and approved by the Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal to convert the two fleet submarines USS Cusk and USS Carbonero to experimental launch platforms for Loon missiles. On 12 February 1947, while off the coast of Point Mugu, California, USS Cusk became the first submarine to fire a guided missile. The Loon program was canceled in 1953. In reality, the Loon was never meant to be an operational weapon for submarines, but the test proved valuable in training crews and gaining experience in launching missiles from submarines, particularly with the later Regulus nuclear-tipped missiles. And it's also worth noting that while the Cusk was technically the first one to fire a guided missile, at the time the Navy designated any kind of missile, whether it be a cruise missile or a ballistic missile, as quote-unquote guided, since it could be aimed, essentially, at a target. So even though ballistic missiles technically are not guided, so to speak, they simply follow a ballistic trajectory, at the time anyway, even those were classified as guided missiles. Additional test firings of the Loon missile followed in the coming years, and on 7 July 1948, a unique incident occurred when Cusk fired 2 Loon missiles. During the second test firing, the missile exploded and caught the deck on fire. One sailor recalled, quote, "Something went horribly wrong. One of the rocket balls exploded on the deck of the Cusk, and the missile, which was full of JP-5, like kerosene, exploded and dove down on the deck of the submarine. Horrified onlookers saw the boat disappear beneath a towering fireball and smoke cloud. Everyone thought the Cusk had sunk," remembers Captain Pat Murphy. But the Cusk captain, Fred Berry, saw what had happened through the periscope and saw that there was no hull rupture. Well, he submerged. They had all the water they needed to put out the fire. The Cusk survived with minor damage. So there was no real cause for alarm, and Cusk turned out alright in the end. Now finally, let me end off with some miscellaneous anecdotes. Tony related a couple of other stories about USS Barbel to me. For example, Barbel once got spotted by a friendly aircraft while transiting on the surface from San Diego to Pearl Harbor, and the captain later got in trouble for this. Now, while this may not seem like much of a transgression, the Barbel class, with their teardrop-shaped hulls, were some of the first diesel-electric submarines designed for better underwater than surfaced speed and performance. Our examination of Blueback's early deck logs shows that how much time the boat spent on the surface or snorkeling depended heavily on who was the skipper. The logs show that some skippers preferred to spend most of the day snorkeling or on the surface, and this is because these early skippers of the boat spent the majority of their early careers on fleet boats, which were essentially surface ships that could also dive underwater to attack or hide. The post-war guppy conversions of the fleet boats, particularly those that got snorkel conversions, represented more of a transitional period of submarine design within the US Navy, and this also meant that snorkeling was fairly new to the US Navy and their submarines. A heavy sea state also posed problems for snorkeling submarines because a wave can wash over the air induction and force the head valve on the snorkel to close. This deprives the diesel engines and the submarine of air, so the engines must be shut down to prevent creating a vacuum inside the boat and suffocating the crew. Often a diesel-electric submarine like Blueback would just ride out heavy seas on the surface if it needed to charge its batteries. The issue is that the teardrop-shaped hull is not well designed for sea keeping on the surface, so the boat would pitch and roll in every direction, even in very mild swells. It would not be a comfortable ride. Some veterans of this class have also told me that in heavy seas, this thing would be doing rolls of like 45 degrees or more when it surfaced, so you'd pretty much be walking on the bulkheads at times. Now, speaking of being uncomfortable, one particularly cramped space to work in on the Barbel class boats was the battery air plenum. Now, on Blueback, there's this teeny tiny door, you would completely miss it if you weren't looking for it, that's outboard of the freezers, and it leads into the plenum to service the air filters. Now, Tony, when he recently reported aboard Barbel, was tasked one day with crawling through this door to do some maintenance in there. And since he was a small 5'9", 160-pound guy and new to the boat, he got that pleasant duty. Now, another anecdote Tony related to me was that Barbel had small jukeboxes on the outboard wall of the crew's mess. However, they still had to insert 5 cents into these, so he said that one of the chiefs would be keeping a stash of coins so the crew could play these records when they were off watch. And finally, another interesting story about USS Barbel, although not related to any of Tony's memories, involves her time on the big screen. USS Barbel was decommissioned on 4 December 1989, and she went to a scrapper who removed the sail and some of the superstructure. However, what was left of the hull appeared in the 1995 Tony Scott film Crimson Tide. Specifically, the scene where the crew is lined up at the pier and waiting to get underway early on in the film. A fake plywood sail and superstructure were placed on top of the hull, and some cosmetic changes were made to make her resemble an Ohio-class ballistic missile boat. Now, anybody familiar with the size of an Ohio-class submarine will instantly be able to tell that what's in that shot is definitely a different submarine because the hull is far too small. A Barbel-class submarine is 219 feet long and 29 feet wide at the beam. In contrast, an Ohio-class ballistic missile submarine is 560 feet long and 42 feet wide at the beam. They are the largest submarines currently in the United States Navy, and they're going to be surpassed by the Columbia-class around the 2030s, which will be maybe about 1 foot wider. Now, the main giveaways in the shot are the fact that you don't see the hull extending much further behind the sail when it should. And if you look at the men standing topside on deck, they are far too large when compared to the overall size of the hull itself. Not to mention that the sail structure and the fairwater planes are oversized for the hull of a Barbel-class submarine. Now, funny enough, in the very next scene, the film does show the actual USS Alabama, SSBN 731, submerging when going out to sea. Now, if the film's trivia page on imdb.com is to be believed, the film crew was tipped off by a civilian informant and waited outside the entrance to Pearl Harbor with boats and a helicopter to film the submarine as it left port and then submerged. While the Navy did file a complaint about filming one of its vessels without permission, it technically was not illegal because the submarine was in public view at the time. Now, the fact that this submarine was the actual Alabama, as in the film, was a sheer coincidence. But that's how the story goes with that. As for the hull of Barbel herself, she was eventually returned to Navy ownership, where she rusted away as a hulk at the pier in San Pedro until she was towed out to sea and sunk as a target on 30 January 2001 off the coast of California. Being a former USS Barbel sailor, Tony represents a wealth of information about this class of submarine. What's even more unique is that he served on Barbel very early in her service, so he provides a snapshot of how these boats were operated at the time and what kind of equipment they had. In this regard, it's interesting to compare Tony's experiences on Barbel with Rick Nolt's experiences on Bonefish and Blueback late in their service. You could ask these two men the same question about this class of submarine, and you'll potentially get two very different answers, but both will be accurate, because it just goes to show that all three boats of the Barbel class were different, since they're all built by different shipyards. And they all changed with regard to their layout and equipment as they went through various refits and dry dock throughout their service. Now, that's generally true for all ships, but it's just more pronounced here since we have these two men to talk to. So anyway, in conclusion, that was my interview with Tony Capitano. He's a friendly guy who loves telling stories about his time in the Navy on 3 different submarines. Tony can recall a lot of interesting facts about USS Barbel early on in her service, and he represents one of our 2 Barbel-class sailors. So between Tony and Rick Nolt, we have all 3 subs in the class covered at the beginning and end of their careers. In many ways, these men represent a bygone era of submarine service in the US Navy, that is, the old diesel boats. These sailors live by the adage of DBF, diesel boats forever. As another kind of fun little tidbit of information, the DBF pin originated in 1970 from a USS Barbel sailor, ETR-3 Leon Figueredo. But that's kind of for another time. As always, I encourage anyone to come down for a tour of USS Blueback if you're in the Portland area. Regardless of whether it's your first time or you've taken multiple tours of the boat before, we all give different tours and have different stories to tell. If you can't take a tour, you can always donate to the museum, which goes a long way towards supporting OMSI as an institution. More information about the Oregon Museum of Science and Industry, as well as USS Blueback, can be found at the museum's website at omsi.edu. OMSI is a nonprofit organization that receives support from various sources, including generous donations from people like you. Well, that was it. My interview with Tony Capitano. Thank you everyone for listening, and have a great day.